Hi, I'm Marshall Labadie, Environmental Director with West Bloomfield Township, here with another environmental update for Civic Center News. Today's topics are wetlands. Wetlands are lands characterized by the presence of water at a frequency and duration adequate to support wetland vegetation and aquatic life. With West Bloomfield Township's 26 lakes, it's no wonder that we have over 3,000 acres of wetlands here in the township. With me today is John Rhoda, our environmental specialist with West Bloomfield, here to discuss wetlands with you today. John, if you could, what is a wetland?
Well, that's a good question. To properly define what a wetland is a low-lying depression within the landscape, usually found in between upland-type areas and deep water aquatic habitats. Wetlands can come in vast amount of different types that, depending on three scientific criteria based on soils, vegetation, and the presence of hydrology, and how it gets its hydrology, meaning water, is what makes a wetland a wetland.
So what are the major types of wetlands that we have here in the township?
Out of all the different types of wetlands we have here in West Bloomfield, we have open lake or lacustrine type environment, riverine or river, stream type environment, scrub shrub wetland type environment, forested wetland type environment, wet meadow type environment, and all depending on how they receive their water, either being from precipitation from the sky, snow melt, ice melt, groundwater seepage, spring, high groundwater table, connected to a river, connected to a lake, is different ways of how these different wetlands get their hydrology, which classifies them into different types of wetlands. This one is more of what you would classify as a sedge wet meadow type wetland. There is no physical standing water that you would see like in a lake or an open pond, which some people might not understand that you're looking at an actual wetland. This type of wetland has different vegetation in it that other vegetation wasn't thriving in across the surface of the wetland like in the open water. The reason is because of water depth. The saturated soils here are so saturated at just inches deep rather than feet, or I would say more than 6 inches to a foot deep. This is just maybe an inch or two as far as inundated water goes. And there's a lot of foxtail sedge in here. There's other shrub species in here. Looks like silky dogwood is in here. A cattail, of course. Cattail is a obligate wetland species. Willow, poplar. Our next wetland type, I'm actually walking in upland woods type area, is riverine or stream type environment. Quite different than your open pond, scrub shrub type wetland. A lot more different than your wet meadow type area. This usually throughout the year has running water in it. It has so much running water that when it actually flows through, creating its depression area, it actually creates a bed, a bank, and sides. That's what you can classify what a river is or what a stream actually is. It has aggregate along the bed, which provides riffles in the stream, which actually down water where the river does meander, or the stream meanders, it actually does scour away and create pool areas for fish habitat, fish spawning habitat, macroinvertebrate habitat. Other than that, you simply have the same type of vegetation along the banks that we've seen before. I don't know if you can catch this. There might be a tree in my way, but there is blue flag iris inside here, which is an obligate wetland species. So there is probably a little bit of wetland adjacent to the stream area. There's duck pondweed along the edge. So not only does this actually transport sediments and nutrients and things like this, before the water gets from the regular open wetland system and travels downstream through river channels like this is what we're trying to protect, that upstream water to be a lot more cleaner and treated before it enters a stream area like this. Now obviously it provides a lot of habitat for, like I said, macroinvertebrates, small fish spawning, different insects, butterflies, a water source for deer, fox, all sorts of other rodent and animals. And this is just one of another type we have here in West Bloomfield. Okay, for our final stop, what we have here is an adjacent or littoral wetland area that's adjacent to a lake. Actually, starting back here, from the naked eye to the general public, you might not really realize you're in wetland area. But actually, starting here, where you have lake bank or lake bank sedge, you have different type of reeds, cattail once again, old purple loosestrife in there. Bayberry, which is a shrub species, and then what you have is marsh area, and that's the marsh area opening up to a lake type environment. And I figured for this installment, this would be the final wetland type that I really would like to talk about here in West Bloomfield. As we're walking down on the dock here, you'll see that most of the composition of plant species in here is cattail. So this is what you would call a cattail marsh, or an emergent cattail marsh, which is pretty much dominant of cattails. Typha latifolia is the Latin term. And as you can see, you're starting to enter the lake as well with the standing water. One thing, other vegetation that people may not really be aware about it are lily pads. Lily pads is actually a free-floating or free-floating attached type vegetation. There's a few different types of that. Either it's floating on top, or actually there's a stalk underneath that goes submersed into the water and attaches to the lake bottom. One thing that this cattail marsh actually provides is erosion control along the shoreline of the lake with wave action that comes in off of the lake. So this actually acts as a natural vegetative buffer that protects the shoreline of the lake. And as you can see, we have more free-floating vegetation, white lily pad, white lilies. More lake bank sedge. You see the vegetation out here that has the spade type leaf to it? It's pickerel weed. You can see little groupings of it out there. And you can tell by looking at the vegetation how they do colonize, or how they do populate themselves, and where they establish themselves randomly throughout the area, depending on the depth of the water. They can only survive to about a depth of about a foot of water, and that's where they're at right now. And as you get into a deep water habitat out towards the lake, you won't see that vegetation anymore, because the water is just simply too deep. There's still wetland vegetation though, along the bottom, submerged wetland. The reason why I call lily pad free floating attached is because it's free floating on the surface of the water, but if the camera can actually see in the water, it's actually attached to the sediment, to the lake floor itself. And you can see fish in there. Perfect habitat for fish spawning area, fish hiding, breeding, hunting for different macroinvertebrates to eat. A lot of different minnows in here. If you notice how there's no vegetation here except the free-floating attached vegetation, then it's open water. And then if you look about 100 yards out, you'll see bulrush, a thicket of bulrush through there. Now the only way bulrush is going to grow where there was once open water is where it gets shallow enough again for the bulrush to grow. So basically the lake bottom is slightly getting deeper, and then coming back up to the surface of where the air meets the water. I had fun. Hopefully our camera crew had fun going to all these different wetland types. There's a lot more wetland types here in the township, however, time given, I wanted to go to the most picturesque ones we could find.
We always hear about the importance of wetlands. What I'd like to know, and maybe some of the viewers would like to know, what are the major functions of a wetland within our environment?
Some of the main functions of wetlands here in this area is, number one, habitat for wildlife, which is the number one thing we're trying to preserve here, as well as floodwater storage to help any type of flooding in the surrounding area from upland type areas. Most of our areas here have development, subdivisions, residential housing around them. So these wetlands actually act as protection from flooding any of the surrounding areas. Another function that wetlands provide would be erosion control for downriver waters. As wetlands do receive their water, it stays in the wetland to retain, to filter out sediments, to filter out fertilizers before it finds its way downstream into larger river areas. This particular area, we're in the Rouge River watershed area. These waters that we're protecting here, because we're at the higher point of the elevation of the watershed, will eventually find its way down to the Detroit River and out to Dearborn, or through Dearborn to the Detroit River. So the more we protect up here, the more benefit downstream waters will get. As well as stormwater storage, erosion protection, wildlife habitat, recharge water, groundwater table as well for people that have wells and things like that.
Another curious question we have is, how would you exactly determine the limits of a wetland? Many callers come in, calling you and I, saying, how would we determine where that wetland is? So how would we determine, what are the factors that we use to determine the limits, the outer boundaries of a wetland?
Well, first, the first thing you want to understand is, where are you in the landscape? Where exactly are you? Are you high ground or are you low ground? Knowing where you are in the landscape, pretty much to a trained eye, you could pretty much tell where a wetland would be at. Sometimes it gets really difficult to find out where you're actually at in a landscape, especially when the vegetation is so thick that you really don't know where you're at. So, to answer that question, if you know you're in a lower type area within the landscape, the first thing I look for is evidence of hydrology, meaning is there standing water everywhere? But that's not the truth in most cases. Not all wetlands are defined by standing water. There could be no water present, but the soil is saturated enough throughout the year that the soils actually give hydric characteristics away that give wetland soils. So number one, it would be evidence of hydrology. Dark stained leaves on the ground, high water marks on trees, buttressed trees, meaning the roots are trying to grasp the earth. Other than that, evidence of hydrology, if it's present, great. If it's not, then the second parameter that I'd like to use is vegetation. Some vegetation, which mostly live in upland type areas, is where the only place you're going to find those type of trees or type of shrubs. So if I'm walking through, say, a wooded area, and I know that I'm looking at a black oak, for instance, or a black cherry, for instance, those are more upland type trees. You're not going to find those typically in a wetland area. When you're getting into where there's more elm or ash or cranberry highbush viburnum or red twig dogwood, which are just a couple of species of shrub, then chances are you're getting to the border of where a wetland is actually at. Other type of plants that you find in wetlands are herbaceous type emergent plants like cattail, spike rush, phalaris, quite a bit of different type of perennials too that you'll find in wetland areas that don't really only grow in mostly wet soils throughout the growing season. Third parameter would be hydric soils, as I mentioned previously. What you'd actually have to do is take samples of the soil and take a look at the color of the soil. Higher upland type soils will have a higher tan or brownish type color to it. But if you start seeing a dark gray or dark black intermingling with that upland color type, then chances are you're either in a wetland or you're at the edge of a wetland. And those are really the three parameters that you would delineate where a wetland is actually at.
With the colors that you're talking about in hydric soils, what's creating the color change as it goes down through the soil profile? What makes that change? What's the presence? What factor is changing that soil type?
Well, it's a physiochemical reaction, actually, what's happening to the soil. Normal soil, upland soil, is an aerobic soil, meaning it's air-loving, meaning it's always getting oxygen or enough oxygen, and that's what gives it its tan or copperish hue or color. When it gets to an anaerobic state, meaning with water or standing in water, the longer duration of time inundated water or saturated water is in the soils, usually anytime from 14 days on. If it's wet enough long throughout the growing season, you'll actually have gray modeling going on, meaning that upland soil is now getting choked out from the air. So basically what's happening is a redox reaction, meaning that some soils is being reduced while other things are being oxidized. The normal soils that were oxidized at one point in time are now being reduced, giving electrons away, I believe, is if I'm correct on that. But I'm more biology than chemistry, but that's okay. But that's the physiochemical reaction that's happening in the soil, that it's going from an upland soil to a more dark, rich, wetland type soil, and you can tell that by the coloring of the actual soil. And what this is called a soil auger. And basically what you do is you just use it like a corkscrew, like say when you want to open up a bottle of wine or something like that. You basically just stick it right into the ground, give it a couple twists, pull it out, push it down, give it a few twists like this, pull it out. You got to watch your back. And it takes out a soil sample like this. Earlier when I was talking to Marshall, I was telling you about the redox chemical reaction that soils undergo. What you take is a small soil sample, the best you can. Try not to ruin it too much. And basically you split it in half, and you can, this is a very dark wetland soil. Depending on if you're dealing with clay, silty, loam, silt, sand, there's different characteristics of how deep you actually go. This type of soil is more like a sandy type loam with very dark soils. You can actually see some of the lighter soils that was just at the surface. So it's getting its fair amount of oxygen. Just underneath that layer you start getting the darker type soils. And when you're getting into dark brown, very dark brown, black or gray, according to the handy Munsell soil chart, you actually open up to normally what wetland scientists use is a 10YR, which is a 10-year soil. And when you get down in more of this type color right in here, with the upland type soil in there, called the modeling, this is where you would really hang your hat on if you're dealing with wetland soil or not. Up in here would be more of an upland soil. So as you can see, we're dealing with wetland soil. So, if the hydrology is there, the soils are there, the vegetation is there, then what I do is take wetland boundary tape and I actually flag the perimeter of the wetland right along the edge of where I believe upland is and where wetland is. According to this, I would go right here where the cattail's at. Usually what I do is give it a couple knots like that and I'll label it. And usually if this is my starting point, I'll put a start, A1. Then my next flag down the way would be A2, and then A3, and then A4, and I will continue along the whole circumference of what the wetland is for the wetland edge. And I can only do the wetland determination for the specific property that's asking me to do it. Sometimes I may get off the property because, well, wetlands have minds of their own. They don't have any jurisdictional boundaries. They just go where they want to go. So that's how I delineate wetlands. That's how I'll 100% gets done as far as wetland science and wetland managers that have the proper certification and education to flag what a wetland is.
To wrap this up a little bit on our topic of wetlands, what are some of the threats we're finding to our wetland systems here in the township?
The most threats that wetlands actually go through, not only here in the township, throughout the whole state, if not country, throughout the whole world, is actually just human influence. Filling in wetlands, cutting into wetlands, draining wetlands, dredging wetlands, using it for agricultural reasons, timber harvesting. There's quite a multitude of threats that wetlands actually go through. There's also weather and climate, certain floods, certain droughts, certain wave actions off of lakes or oceans, but we're not in an ocean type atmosphere or environment. But mostly it's human influence, and a lot of times it's just not knowing. A lot of times there's not regulations in place that whoever's inflicting on these wetland areas actually really know or understand the benefits and the actual value that wetlands have. So
Great.
A lot of times their highest threat is human influence, and mostly because they just don't know.
Thank you. That brings us into our closing, in which I wanted to say that if you live near a wetland, you can contact West Bloomfield Township Environmental Department to get a wetland determination done. So you just got to come into the township, apply for it. John will come out and actually identify those limits for you. If you plan to do any work within a wetland, it does require a permit, as does working in a floodplain, in a river, creek, stream, and or lake. We also protect the setback to those features, which also requires a permit. So for more information on if you need a permit, or to have John come out and tell you where the wetlands are on your property, please visit Township Hall or check out our website at www.wbtwp.com, and then scroll into the Environmental Department for more information. Also, you can give us a call at 248-451-4818. Again, I'd like to thank John Rhoda, our environmental specialist, for coming out here today. And again, I'm Marshall Labadie with another environmental update for Civic Center News.